Imagine being stranded in an unfathomable, icy cold temperature with a team under your responsibility, unsure of whether you would make it back home alive. Well, this is exactly what Sir Ernest Shackleton and his crew had to go through during an attempt to journey across Antarctica. Now, before we dive into this grueling journey, let's find out more about who Sir Ernest Shackleton was. Born in Ireland on February 15, 1874, Ernest was primarily raised in England. He was a restless child who grew tired of school. With permission from his own father, Shackleton joined the crew of a commercial sailing ship at the age of 16. He rose through the ranks, becoming expedition leader, and rose to a position of officer in the Royal Navy. Now, from 1901 to 1909, Shackleton would participate and lead various successful British expeditions to Antarctica. One of these Shackletons was the Nimrod expedition. Now, during this expedition, the area of the South Magnetic Pole was discovered. This expedition was also responsible for the ascent of Mount Erebus, which is known as the second highest volcano in all of Antarctica. Upon his arrival from the Nimbus expedition, Shackleton received many medals and honors, including being knighted Sir Ernest Shackleton. However, even with all the honors and medals, Sir Ernest Shackleton was far from content with settling down. In fact, he was planning on another expedition, his biggest one yet. Crossing Antarctica, Sir Ernest Shackleton was motivated to complete any expedition that no one else had, which was crossing the continent of Antarctica from one coast to the other via the South Pole. He began to plan the Grand British Imperial Transatlantic Expedition. The total miles for the expedition to complete were 1,800. Shackleton's plan included 2 ships and a crew of 56 men, which would be split evenly among them. The first ship, Endurance, was directly under Shackleton's command. The plan was this: Endurance would sail from the South Georgia Island in the southern Atlantic Ocean. The second ship, Aurora, would sail from Australia to the opposite end of Antarctica. Shackleton and his crew on Endurance would be the ones completing the journey. The crew on Aurora would be going inland and setting up supply depots, as well as offering Endurance assistance when the crew arrived. The journey was kick-started in December of the year 1914. This was also the beginning of the summer for the Southern Hemisphere. To reach Antarctica's shore, the Endurance would have to move through impenetrable packed ice, as well as shifting ice flows. While they sailed, they faced their first obstacle. The density of the ice grew thick as they sailed, which slowed the ship's passage to that of a crawl. In Shackleton's autobiography, he had stated that he had prepared for treacherous conditions, but even this first obstacle was one that he had not expected. Endurance sailed for about a month. Shackleton could see the shore of Antarctica. It seemed like perhaps the expedition would continue as planned when trouble happened. Endurance was about 100 miles, roughly one day's sail, away from the destination when ice closed in around him, crushing the ship completely. The temperatures dropped fiercely, which cemented the loose ice around the ship. The ship's storekeeper wrote that the ship was like an almond in a piece of toffee. Though this ice incident happened with other ships crossing similar regions in the past, it was still a huge disappointment. There were many attempts to free the ship from the ice, as sometimes crack would show on the ice surface, and men would set to work on this with improved heavy chisels and iron bars. However, all these attempts never yielded any success. The ship continued to be completely stuck in the ice, and the ice drifted north and away from Antarctica shore with each passing day. February ended, and temperatures dropped to negative 20 degrees Celsius, which would be negative 4 Fahrenheit. Months continued to pass without salvation in sight. There wasn't any chance of calling rescue from where Endurance was. So, the ship and its crew continued to float further and further away from Antarctica shore. The crew was restless, and there was regular football and hockey games that took place to pass the time. May and winter arrived. Then July came, and it seemed like perhaps things were looking up as the ice began to break up somewhat. However, August and September brought storms that made the Endurance's situation even worse. Endurance endured until October 24th, punctured by an ice in the hull. Water began to flood the boat. Shackleton ordered all 28 members of his crew to abandon ship as soon as possible and to bring all the necessary supplies to camp on the ice. The supplies the men had for survival included some remaining food, various packs of sled dogs, and 3 30-foot lifeboats. 3 days later, October 27th, Shackleton wrote, "The position was latitude 69 south long, 5130 west. The temperature was negative 8.5 Fahrenheit, a gentle southerly breeze was blowing, and the sun shone in a clear sky. After long months of ceaseless anxiety and strain, after times when hope beat high, and times when the outlook was black indeed, we have been compelled to abandon the ship which is crushed beyond all hope of ever being righted, and we have stores and equipment for the task that lies before us. The task is to reach land with all members of the expedition. It is hard to write what I feel. In the span of 281 days, the Endurance had become trapped in the ice. It had drifted roughly 1,186 miles. With Shackleton's orders, the men pitched 5 tents about 100 yards from where Endurance sat, but this plan had to quickly be aborted as the ice beneath them had begun to split. In case the men's temporary camp on ice was developed on a thick and heavy ice cap that was 1.5 miles from the wrecked ship. Now finally, on November 21st, 1915, the Endurance broke and sank to the bottom of the Weddell Sea. The crew had saved as much as they could before abandoning ship, but it's certain there must have been a lot of personal belongings and other treasured items that were lost with the Endurance. Luckily, the crew's photographer, an Australian named Andrew Hurley, was able to save his camera. This is why there are thankfully now various photographs online that capture the grueling journey for Shackleton and his crew. In terms of Shackleton and his crew, it seemed like their options were dwindling with each passing minute. Endurance was wrecked, and they were camping on top of a drifting chunk of ice. The clock was ticking particularly fast, because spring was underway and the ice they were on was beginning to crack and thaw. December 20th, Shackleton made the decision that he and his men would abandon camp and march on the ice toward open water. They would be taking lifeboats along as well, and once reaching the water, would attempt the journey to Paulet Island, which they believed to be the nearest land. This island was estimated to be about 250 miles away. Bad luck never seemed to leave the crew. As with December came warmer temperatures. The warm temperatures made the ice soft, which significantly slowed down the men as they progressed toward the open shore. This obstacle brought tensions and a mutiny nearly erupted. Shackleton abandoned his initial plan of reaching the island, and the crew set up a camp which they coined Patience Camp. Shackleton and his crew were waiting for the ice to provide an opening for them to travel onward. This would take then 2 months. Supplies dwindled, and the men found themselves hunting seals and penguins to survive. When they ran out of hunting options, they were forced to eat the dogs they had brought with them. Sorry, Spot. It seemed like times were only growing more and more bleak for Shackleton and the Endurance crew. However, on April 8, 1916 was the day when things began to look up for the men. The ice split, allowing the men to journey on an open stretch of water and on lifeboats they had saved from Endurance. For a couple of days, the crew and Shackleton completed the tasks of hauling the boats over broken up and ridged ice caps. Within the days, Shackleton made a startling discovery in terms of path of their journey. The men had actually traveled 30 miles to the east due to the drifting ice, which put them further away from the island. However, not all hope was lost for the men, and the way they upheld morale and continued to survive whatever obstacles they faced so far is often attributed to their bravery and Shackleton's leadership skills. Though their initial plan had not worked out, Shackleton and the crew were about to spot Elephant Island. The open water was easier to navigate as they approached this barren land. Now finally, after around 500 days since being on land, they were ecstatic to step on it once again when arriving at Elephant Island. This was not the ideal spot for the crew to land on, but it was land after all. The island was uninhabited and barren. The crew found a spot to camp on which they dubbed Point Wild. Shackleton wrote after setting down in the temporary camp, "As we clustered round the blubber stove with the acrid smoke blowing in our faces, we were quite a cheerful company. Life was not so bad. We ate our evening meal while the snow drifted down from the surface of the glacier and our chilled bodies grew warm." Though they were safe for the time being, Shackleton knew this was not land they could camp on for much longer. It was far from civilization and their supplies were still limited. The crew was still stranded and there was no way of getting in contact with anyone. There was no chance of rescue and no ships passed in that direction. It wasn't like the men had a radio to call for help either. Another perilous journey, Elephant Island was still a very isolated land, one that outside rescue would not really step foot in. Shackleton realized this and got to work formulating a plan to reach rescue. If rescue would not come to the men on this island, Shackleton and his crew members would journey off the island and go to it. The plan was this. Shackleton and a few men would travel on one of the lifeboats to a whaling station in South Georgia, which was about 800 miles away and still the nearest inhabited location for them. The journey to this location would also involve having to travel through the most stormy stretch of ocean in the world. During this journey, it was expected the men would encounter waves that were higher than 50 feet and would have to navigate with the help of the sun, which was rare as conditions were usually overcast in the area. Shackleton chose Frank Wild, his second in command, to stay behind with the men on Elephant Island. If Wild and the rest of the men saw that no rescue came their way, they would have to travel to Deception Island, which was used by whalers and sealers. On April 24th, Shackleton and 5 of his men set off. They used the lifeboat named James Caird, which was named after one of the financial sponsors of the expedition, and as it was the least damaged of the 3 lifeboats. The crew's carpenter reinforced the boat with wood and canvas from the other 2 lifeboats, and the whole was coated with an oil paint and coagulated blood from the seals the men had hunted earlier. While Shackleton and the 5 crew members made the journey, the remaining men in the camp used the 2 lifeboats to make a hut by turning them upside down and placing them on 2 low stone walls. The tent and sail fabric were used as lining for this makeshift hut to keep the wind and extreme weather conditions out. The party also used a blubber stove for heat and to cook. This stove was designed to consume blubber for fuel, hence the name. Though Frank Wild and the remaining men had received instructions by Shackleton in the case of rescue failing to come their way, it was more than likely the men would perish if Shackleton and the other crew members did not reach rescue in time. Quarters were cramped and food was in very limited supply. In fact, while waiting for Shackleton, the other crew members, one of the men had to have his frostbitten toes amputated by a surgeon on the crew. The surgeon completed this procedure with only the meager light of the blubber stove guiding him. Shackleton and the 5 men anticipated the journey to last about a month. It was recorded that the James Caird progressed between 60 to 70 miles each day through extremely rough sea conditions. The small boat faced astonishingly high waves and brutal winds. The sea was constantly coming into the boat and getting the men's sleeping bags wet. It was extremely difficult to find any warmth on the journey. Aggressive storms came their way plenty of times. Temperatures dropped and ice formed on the outside of the boat due to the frozen spray of the sea. The men tried to chip away at the ice with makeshift tools, but this did little to help the situation. At one point, the men found themselves throwing things overboard to help ease the weight on the boat. Spare oars and even 2 sleeping bags that had become weighted down due to accumulating ice were thrown overboard. The only comfort the men found during this tumultuous journey were the meals they had periodically every 4 hours using a Primus stove. In no time, frostbite became an issue. Exposed fingers and hands in the cold and wet atmosphere were at risk. Overcast conditions made it hard for navigation. But around the 7th day, the sun broke through, and one of the 5 crew members calculated that they were about halfway to their destination. Around the 11th day of their journey, when conditions seemed to worsen, Shackleton wrote down this frightening event. I called to the other men and the sky was clearing, and then a moment later, I realized that what I had seen was not a rift in the clouds, but the white crest of an enormous wave. During 26 years' experience of the ocean in all its moods, I had not encountered a wave so gigantic. It was a mighty upheaval of the ocean, a thing quite apart from the big white-capped seas that had been our tireless enemies for days. I shouted, "For God's sake, hold on, it's got us!" Then came a moment of suspense that seemed drawn out into hours. White surged the foam of the breaking sea around us. We felt our boat lifted and flung forward like a cork in the breaking surf. We were in a seething chaos of tortured water. But somehow, the boat lived through it, half full of water, sagging to the dead weight and shuddering under the blow. We bailed with the energy of men fighting for life, flinging the water over the sides with every receptacle that came to our hands. And after 10 minutes of uncertainty, we felt the boat was able to renew her life beneath us. About 14 days later, the men began to see kelp floating in the water and seabirds. They caught a glimpse of South Georgia. The journey had been about half the days they had initially thought. Rough water conditions did make landing difficult. There was a shift in the wind and a very bad storm that arose and tossed the James Caird around, further moving the men away from the shore of their destination. However, finally, after 16 days of travel, the James Caird was able to land on the South Georgia beach. The small lifeboat had prevailed against the rough weather conditions that had put so many obstacles in its path, tossing it around and threatening to push it back into the hungry ocean once more. It seemed like there was still one more obstacle to hurdle through to get to the salvation of rescue. Shackleton and his small crew had landed about 22 miles from the whaling station they needed to contact for rescue for the crew left on Elephant Island. There were 2 options to get there: get back on the lifeboat and attempt to sail around the island, or to complete the trek on foot. The trek on foot entailed going through the backbone of the mountains that were basically, at the time, uncharted territory. Shackleton made the decision to complete the journey to the whaling station on foot. 2 of his men had been weakened by the sailing journey to the South Georgia. The 2 men stayed behind with another crew member, and Shackleton and the other 2 began their new excursion on foot. It was the 15th of May when the 3 men set off. Planning to trek through the icy terrain, the 3 men pushed screws through the soles of their boots to improvise crampons. This was a smart plan, as the men would encounter snow, fields, icy slopes, and even glaciers while making their way to the whaling station. The 3 men did not sleep on their journey. They slid through icy slopes when the altitude was too high, and they only stopped to eat a hot meal that would renew their strength for the journey ahead. They had journeyed for about a day or so, and around 5 in the morning, the men had to stop and rest. The men sat atop a large rock and wrapped their arms around each other for warmth. Shackleton shook his 2 men awake as they had fallen asleep. No doubt if all 3 had fallen asleep at that moment, they may have never awoken. The temperatures were freezing, and the men were impacted by their excursion. But they had to continue, and so they did. Finally, after a day and a half of walking, the men reached the whaling station. Their journey culminated with traveling through a stream that covered them waist level with icy water and through a waterfall by tying rope they brought along with them to a rock. The 3 men even tried to fix their appearance before walking into the whaling station, but there was only so much they could do. The time stranded during their expedition had forced their beards to grow long. Their hair was matted, and even their clothes were old and shredded. They had not been washed in more than a year. Shackleton noted this: "We had entered a year and a half before the well-found ship, full equipment and high hopes. We had suffered, starved, and triumphed. groveled down yet grasped at glory, grown bigger in the business of the whole. We had seen God in his splendors, heard the text that nature renders. We had reached the naked soul of man. Finally, the three men walked outside the Stromness whaling station on May 20th, 1916. Finding the wharf, they asked if the man in charge, Mr. Sorley, was available. Shackleton identified himself, and the men were given opportunities to wash, shave, eat, and most importantly, sleep. They were able to rescue the other three men they had left at the first arrival to St. Georgia, and then begin the plan to rescue the rest of the crew still camping out at Elephant Island. This would be a somewhat long rescue mission, as it would take 3 attempts to finally reach Elephant Island. The first attempt was about 3 days after the men arrived at the whaling station, but pack ice forced them to retreat to the Falkland Islands. Even the Uruguayan government would have to intervene and lend the men a fishing boat. Shackleton even chartered another sailing vessel, but its auxiliary engine would break down while traveling. In total, Shackleton used ships borrowed from the Uruguayan government, a British expatriate in Argentina, and finally, one from the Chilean government. It seemed like the third time was definitely the charm for Shackleton and the other men. On August 30th, 1916, Shackleton and crew arrived at Elephant Island to rescue the remaining crew. The men on Elephant Island couldn't believe their eyes. It had been 128 days since Shackleton and the other 5 men had left on the James Caird in search of rescue. The men on Elephant Island had just about used up all the supplies, so seeing rescue was a much welcome sight. In the end, not a single man of the 28-person crew was lost. Surprisingly, the surviving men on the Elephant Island had used up the last of the meat from their hunts of penguins and seals to survive. If worse came to worse, they had already begun to consider cannibalism. One crew member wrote this: "We shall have to eat the one who dies first." The men had already started to plan what would no doubt be an unsuccessful and fatal journey to get help. But luckily, Shackleton and other rescuers appeared before the men had to do this. There were not just the 28 men under Shackleton to think about either. Remember the other 28 who sailed to the opposite end of Antarctica to meet them. They had also suffered a draining journey on their own. The other half of the crew had been traveling on a ship called the Aurora. An extremely brutal storm would cause heavy damage to the boat, resulting in a party of 10 men left, all stranded on land with very few supplies. Thinking that Shackleton and the other crew would die if the Aurora men did not complete their part of the plan, the men journeyed inland and placed the supplies in the area as agreed. Shackleton would never make it to the men or the supplies. The 10 men from the Aurora remained stranded in Antarctica until January of 1917. 3 of the 10 unfortunately did pass, 1 from scurvy and 2 disappeared, but it was assumed they fell through the ice. After arriving back from the expedition, Shackleton volunteered for the army and served in a diplomatic role due to deteriorating health. He also, of course, a cold weather survival advisor. Shocking many who knew of his story, Shackleton would begin to plan another expedition to Antarctica in 1919. However, before Sir Ernest Shackleton could go on this planned journey, he would die of a heart attack on January 5th, 1922, at the age of 47. A successful expedition across the Antarctic would not be completed until the year of 1958, more than 36 years after Shackleton's attempt. However, Shackleton's 1914 expedition would go down in history for the pure bravery and skill that Shackleton and his men had to show among even the worst obstacles during these fateful months. Scientists and tourists still visit Shackleton's grave to this day. Photographs and the writings of Shackleton and his crew members are what allows us to travel back in time, becoming part of this terrifying expedition, even for just a moment. More importantly, I want to know what you guys think. So be sure to let me know what you think in the comments down below. I would love to hear from all of you. Also, if you're a fan of storytelling of the mysterious and supernatural, be sure to go ahead and hit that like and subscribe for more content just like this. As always, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll catch you guys in the very next video.